Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Identities Events Lecture series. Today's lecture will be Flying While Muslim, Driving While Black, examining the differences in racialized surveillance and policing for African American Muslims. The Identities Lecture Series is in a collaboration with University of Glasgow, School of Social and Political Sciences, and Casey at Lancaster University. Today's talk will be Dr. Saher Selod of Simmons University. In this talk, Dr. Selod will examine how being Muslim and Black guides the types of racialized policing and surveillance that men and women encounter, and how race, ethnicity, and gender inform the types of policing and surveillance they experience. Dr. Selod will explore how federal security and local policing operate under different racialized constructions of threat. The construct of the terrorist is a racial one that drives counterterrorism policies that mark Muslims as dangerous to national security, while the war on drugs has marked African Americans as drug offenders and violent domestic criminals, making them susceptible to hyper-policing. Dr. Selod is associate professor and previous chair of the Department of Sociology at Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts. Her research expertise centers on the experiences of Muslims with surveillance. In her first book, Forever Suspect, Racialized Surveillance of Muslim Americans in the War on Terror, Rutgers University Press 2018, she examines how Muslim men and Muslim women experience gendered forms of racialization through their hyper-surveillance because of the War on Terror. Her co-authored second book, A Global Racial Enemy, Muslims and 21st Century Racism, Polity Press 2024, examines how the global war on terror has justified the detention, imprisonment, and hyper-surveillance of Muslims in the United States, the United Kingdom, India, and China. She is currently director of research for the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, a research organization that conducts studies on American Muslims. She is also co-author with Aaron Rosenthal of the recent Identities article, Flying While Muslim and Driving While Black, examining the differences in racialized surveillance and policing for African American Muslims. It's been online since October 2024. Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power, the journal that is putting this event on, explores the formation and transformation of racial, ethnic, national, transnational, and post-colonial identities in the contemporary world. It locates culture, representations, and identities as key sites for processes of domination, struggle, and resistance, recognizing their intersection with other forms of social division and identification. We provide an interdisciplinary space for new theoretically informed empirical research and critical analysis, which opens up questions of race, ethnicity, and culture. It draws on and brings together insights from anthropology, cultural studies, sociology, and social policy, cultural geography, political science, and social psychology. Identity seeks to engage established and emerging scholars in the field in contributing high-quality articles, special issues, commentaries, and debates which address key questions of culture and identity with which the journal is engaged. And Dr. Selod's work is just such an example of this. And I'd like to open the floor. After the talk, there will be an opportunity for questions. If you just put your questions into the chat, in addition to which, we will also post links to the article and other resources. And now I give the floor over. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And especially thank you to Michaela and Aaron for, organizing, hosting this event. It's a real honor to be speaking today about my research. So just a little bit, I wanted to explain that today I'm going to talk about, the article and some of the data from the article, as well as some other data that I was able to collect on this topic. So excited to hear your feedback, comments after the presentation. And I just want to also note that this article was co-authored with my former colleague, Aaron Rosenthal, a political scientist who was at Simmons University with me, and also was the one who sort of inspired and got this project, came to me and said, let's do this study. So thank you to him for all of his work on this. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of a background on what what we were thinking, what I've been thinking as I engaged in this new topic, looking at the experiences of African American Muslims and Black immigrant Muslims in terms of policing and surveillance. My first book, Forever Suspect: Racialized Surveillance of Muslim Americans in the War on Terror, was a qualitative interview with Arab and South Asian Muslim Americans examining their experiences in a post 9/11 society. So at the time, this was my dissertation research, I was interested in what are Muslim experiences with race. And this was, I conducted these interviews back in 2009. So we're, decades away from that moment. But in that moment, it was very difficult to intellectually and within the canon make the argument that Muslims were experiencing racism in the United States. Much of the scholarship on race had to do with, African Americans and white groups, individuals in the United States because of the history of slavery in the US. So the language was a little bit tricky to make this argument that Muslims as a religious group are also experiencing race and racism. So that book examines through surveillance, our counterterrorism laws and policies domestically, how the argument I make is that Muslims are experiencing a form of racialization. In this latest study, my colleagues Inash Islam, Steve Garner, and myself looked at counterterrorism laws and policies on a global scale. So in this book, we examine counterterrorism laws and policies in the United States, the UK, India, and China. We specifically picked some non-European, non-quote unquote Western countries to show that racialization of Muslims is not just a West and the rest sort of concept, but that it's actually utilized across the globe in places like China and India against a Muslim population for different reasons. So at the core of my research has always been to understand processes of racialization, how groups fit into these processes, how it's fluid, it's not static, it's constantly changing, and that not only is it something that's occurring in the United States, but the global experiences that Muslims have are deeply tied to the experiences of Muslims in the United States. In my book, I define racialization as the process by which bodies become racial in their lived realities because of biological and/or cultural traits as a result of the intersection and cooperation between ideologies, policies, laws, and social interactions that result in the denial of equal treatment in society. Now, I'm not the first. Other scholars in the UK have been looking at racialization, racism against Muslims in Europe. And Omi and Wanat in the United States really provided the language that I found very necessary in their work on racial formations to talk about other groups, that we weren't just, limiting the conversation around race to just phenotypes. Phenotypes still matter, but that it opened up our discussion to include cultural traits, such as for Muslims, the hijab, nation of origin, language, all of these other traits that indeed result in racialized experiences of groups in the United States. But I tweaked these definitions so that we could think about Muslims and how they're experiencing racialization because of their religious identity. Now, I just want to make it clear, Muslims in the United States are a very racially and ethnically diverse population. So they are already racially classified here in the United States. But the argument that I make is that their religious identity further racializes them. So what I essentially have done in all of my work is examine the ways in which counterterrorism laws and policies rely on the racialization of Muslims and also continue to racialize them. So you can see here, these are just a few in the United States, and I'll touch on these at the end of my talk as well to show the large scope of these counterterrorism laws and policies. But prior to 9/11, we did not have TSA, or the Transportation Security Administration. There was no fly list, there was no ICE, and there's another program called Countering Violent Extremism in the United States that is a copycat of a policy from the UK called Prevent, which is a copycat of a Dutch policy. So, we have all of these laws and policies that were put into place after 9/11. And while none of these laws and policies say specifically that you should target Muslims, it's in the very vague and ambiguous language of who is a potential terrorist or threat to national security that results in the racialization of Muslims. So what we have is that, the notion that Muslims are inherently prone to acts of violence because of their religion, resulting in, the need for these national, these counterterrorism laws and policies. Countering violent extremism is a really good example of this because in its first iteration, which was put into place under the Obama administration, these were federal grants that were given to communities with the intent of they would weed out radicalized populations within their communities. So it should be no surprise that several mosques, Muslim community centers were some of the first recipients of these grants in the United States. In fact, where I live in Boston, the Islamic Center here in Boston received one of these grants. So it was this form of surveilling your own community. The federal government was incentivizing this materially. One of the most significant policies and laws that was passed that impacted surveillance was the USA Patriot Act. So the USA Patriot Act passed within a month after 9/11. It was written well before 9/11 happened in the United States, but it greatly expanded the state's surveillance capabilities. So conducting, surveillance without needing warrants, for example, wiretapping phones and things like this. Like it just greatly expanded the state's ability to surveil its population, particularly if it was in an attempt to prevent another terrorist attack. So it really did, it had a huge, grave impact on civil liberties of non-citizens in the United States, particularly Muslims, and also citizens as well. One of the things, though, the USA Patriot Act has done has allowed sneak and peek searches. So police have been able to conduct these sneak and peek searches in search of drugs in the United States, something that prior to the USA Patriot Act, they would have had to go through more steps, checks and balances before conducting these sneak and peek searches. So here is where we start to see the relationship between the war on drugs and the war on terror really we see the lines blurred. So one of the things that we see after 9/11 is that security and policing, the federal, state, local, tribal, and private sectors start to share information in an attempt and in the name of protecting the United States from another terrorist attack and increasing security. So I'll get to some of this a little bit later. But the main thing that I want to sort of shift to and talk about now is that while my previous work has focused on the experiences of South Asian and Arab Muslims, missing were the experiences of African American Muslims and Black immigrant Muslims. So this is a big gap that requires a lot more research. So after, speaking around the country, giving talks about the first book and, this first body of research that I had been conducting, I was always asked, what about African American Muslims? Are they experiencing the same kinds of things that you're showing that Arab and South Asian Muslims are experiencing? And so how are African American Muslims and Black immigrant Muslims experiencing this form of racialization that you're talking about, that Muslims experience? And there are a lot of unique differences that we need to think about and talk about when it comes to African American Muslims compared to South Asian and Arab and even white convert Muslims in the United States. So this inspired, along with a class that I was co-teaching with Aaron Rosenthal at Simmons, we were co-teaching a class on surveillance. He was teaching a section on the war on drugs. I was teaching a section on the war on terror, and then we'd come together and co-teach a class on surveillance in the United States. And it was in this, by co-teaching with him, we decided that we would conduct a study on the experiences of Black and African American Muslims in the United States to see where were the lines being blurred between the war on terror and the war on drugs. So taking one step back before I get into the research studies that I'm going to talk about today, it's important to note that the history of surveillance in the United States goes back to the experiences of enslaved people in the United States. So if you have not read Dark Matters by Simone Brown, I highly recommend this book. It is an incredible study that demonstrates that the surveillance system that was built up in the United States was built up around at the same time as we saw slavery in the United States. So she argues in this book that racializing surveillance and the ways slavery informed surveillance practices is important to note. And this is important because we see in this book that our surveillance capabilities they're being built, they're growing, and it's coming from the experiences of enslaved people in the US. And then we see, later on in history, things like COINTELPRO, where the FBI is surveilling, anyone who's critical of the United States government, which included, people who are advocating for civil rights, like the civil rights movement, but also the Nation of Islam. So this is important because we see this history of surveillance that's based in these experiences that is being used currently for Arab and South Asian Muslims in the United States. So these histories have never been distinct, or these experiences have never been distinct, but they've been connected. Julian Go just recently published a book on policing and imperialism. So in this, he discusses how the militarization of the police that some have noted in the United States when it comes to, around the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, that we're seeing an increased militarization of the police and how they're treating protesters, but indeed that this dates back to the history of policing in the United States, which has always been informed by military tactics that were, used in terms of imperialism and colonialism. So our foreign policy and the use, what we see in terms of the United States engaging in the global war on terror has direct connections to policing in the United States. This is not new, but that there is this long history of it. So this brings me to what I want to talk about today, my research questions. I was interested in how are African Americans and Black immigrants racialized as Muslims compared to South Asian and Arabs? How are their experiences different? How are Muslims surveilled and policed differently? Well, I know from my first book that we can talk about FBI surveillance, the Department of Homeland Security. I have a chapter in my book called Flying While Muslim, which is why that's part of this, this talk as well, because we asked people about their experiences both with local police, but also with TSA agents and the FBI. But do African Americans experience the same kinds of things that I found South Asian and Arabs experienced in airports? Are South Asian and Arab Muslims being stopped by police like African American and Black immigrant Muslims? These were the kinds of questions we have. And one thing that I want to note that I didn't mention is that gender deeply influences the experiences of all Muslims when it comes to racialization. I think it's very vital that you always take into account that race operates in unique ways when it comes to gender. So what are the differential attitudes towards the police? And how do encounters with policing and surveillance impact political participation? And how does gender intersect? So the two that I'm going to talk about today are how are Muslims surveilled and policed differently, and what are the differential attitudes towards the police? So in this talk, I'm going to go over the interview data that's in the article that you will have access to. But I also wanted to pull in some data that I collected when I was a fellow for 2 years at the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. So as part of my fellowship, they provided us with some seed money to do a little bit of research. And as a result, along with several of my colleagues who were PRI fellows, we conducted a YouGov survey of 1,300 respondents, 1,000 Americans with a 300, we oversampled American Muslims in this survey, and we asked them questions on race, religion, and public safety. So I have some survey data that I'm gonna, go through while I go through the qualitative data because they work really well together. For the qualitative interviews, we conducted 47 qualitative interviews. 17 of them were African American Muslims. They're all Muslim. 8 were first and second generation Black immigrant Muslims. 19 were South Asian Muslims. 2 were Arab Muslims, 1 biracial. So the breakdown in terms of gender, 22 were men, 25 were women, and Simmons provided some funding for this, the Innovation and Collaboration Grant, for us to conduct these interviews. So first, I want to talk about the experiences that African American Muslims discussed with me. The majority of the African American Muslims that I interviewed had converted to Islam. So it's important to note that the majority of them did not have Muslim names like South Asian and Arab Muslims and Black immigrant Muslims that we interviewed. They may are going by Muslim names, but the majority of them had not legally changed their names. And just to be clear, we use pseudonyms in this article to protect their identities. So when we were interviewing Jamil, we were asking him about his experiences after 9/11. Did 9/11 make a difference? And his response was resoundingly no, that 9/11 did not make a difference in his experiences. He said that, our Muslim brothers and families, he notes that the immigrant community, they seem to be apologetic. They seem to have a problem trying to convince America that they didn't do it. But for African Americans, it's like we can't figure out what's going on with them. So he notes it's our experiences in a racist America, and we went through the civil rights movement. We're cognitive of the civil rights movement, and we don't have to be a yes person to anybody anymore. 9/11 was a tragedy for everyone, but as African American Muslims, we don't have a burden on us about what happened in 9/11. So he's noting 9/11 did not have this, impact on us. And we are living in this racist society. He also told me that about his experiences driving, that he's routinely stopped for when he's driving, regardless if he's speeding or if he's, driving recklessly, that he experiences these things. Regardless if 9/11 happened or not, these experiences have not changed for him. So this is something that the majority of the African American men and even Black immigrant men that we spoke to talked about. Kareem said, oh yeah, that's a pretty regular thing, driving while Black is not an unusual thing. When I was younger, my beard is a little grayer now. Maybe it happens less, but as a younger man, I was stopped for quote unquote swerving and things like that, probably at least once a year. I don't drink, I don't smoke. I do carry a weapon, but I'm licensed to do so. He's also living in Texas. So when they ask my questions and things, my father was in law enforcement, so he taught me how to answer things, say the bare minimum, keep your hands in your view, look them straight in the eye. 9/11 didn't make any differences or any difference for this. So the men that I talked to, specifically African American men, they had these experiences with race and racism. The older African American men and women that I had talked to, the majority of them talked about coming to Islam via the nation in the 70s, in the late 60s, and that they had eventually converted to Sunni Islam and followed Warith Muhammad, but that they were attracted to Islam because of their experiences with racism in the United States and discrimination, and they found something in the Nation of Islam that was very appealing to them in terms of fighting back against racial discrimination in the United States. And so there's this history of civil rights. There's this history of organizing. Kareem's younger than that. He was in his 40s, I believe, when I talked to him. And he recognizes that 9/11 just didn't change things for him. But what I will show is that the experiences of the policing is deeply tied to counterterrorism laws and policies. And that even if these individuals don't feel like 9/11 didn't make a difference, are the domestic war on terror has made a drastic difference on policing in the United States through our counterterrorism laws and policies. It may not seem so, but that it actually has. Another experience that we found was that for Black immigrant Muslims who came to the United States, that they were actually not, they did not know how to deal with these experiences of driving while Black. So Nurali, who's a South Asian woman who lives in Minnesota, talked about how in their mosque that they had their Black immigrant community watch a video that was to help a Liberian community interact appropriately with the police. And she says that the video was interesting because I guess in their country, when you get pulled over by a cop, you were supposed to get out of the car and go with them, which is completely threatening here in the United States. So if you were to get out of a car when you're stopped by the police, this could result in, violence against the person who was stopped. So it was causing arrests. And so the video helped them understand when you get pulled over, you sit in the car and they're Black. So, it adds another layer of complexity to know how the police interact. So for Black immigrant Muslims, there's this, different experience where they're having to learn how to interact with the police because they're Black and they're being stopped versus African American Muslims, like in the previous in the previous testimony where he says, my father was law enforcement. I know how to respond. I know how to react, that I've been taught how to react when I'm pulled over by the police. So another theme that came up in the study was attitudes towards police. This is a Gallup survey that shows that the differences between white adults and Black adults between 1983 and 2021 in terms of confidence in the police. And obviously you can see that whites have a much higher confidence in the police compared to Black adults. But what about when it comes to South Asian, Arab, and African American and Black Muslims? And this is what really was glaring in the study, is that the differences in the experiences of trust and distrust amongst these populations. So for African American Muslim Muslim women like Hiba, she said that we have issues with gang violence, but the police are just another gang. So I don't want to see a lot of police on the streets. No. Do I want to feel safe? Yes. But I feel like there has to be a way to figure out how to do that without utilizing the same systems that don't work and that discriminate against the people that live here. So she lives in LA, and she said it would take a lot for her to call the police. Would I feel safe calling the police? I would feel like I would have to call the police. Now, could calling the police endanger more people if I was a victim of a crime? Yes. But I would feel like, who else am I going to call to help me? This was overwhelmingly the majority of African American Muslims that were interviewed said no, they're not going to call the police unless it's an extreme case and they had no other choice. So basically, if there was violence, that would be the scenario where they would call the police. Otherwise, they were not going to call the police because they realized that they could be putting themselves and their community, they could expose them to more violence by calling the police. So the police distrust was incredibly high. Just to note, like, a lot of the African American Muslims that we interviewed lived in predominantly African American communities. They also went to predominantly African American mosques. They might if they're working and closer to their work is an immigrant mosque that's highly populated by immigrants, they might go there for Jummah on a Friday. But they discuss the experiences in a Black mosque versus an immigrant mosque, where I heard participants say things, which is not in the article, that they felt like there was a lot of discrimination if it was like an immigrant majority mosque that was South Asian or Arab versus a Black mosque. Some of the Black mosques, particularly in Texas, were in the city and in predominantly Black neighborhoods. So it's a very different experience, just based on location, where African American Muslims live, what mosques they're attending, where their mosques are located. On the other hand, when I talked to South Asian and Arab Muslims, they talked about needing security at mosques. So Nadeem, for example, a Pakistani man, I asked him like about their experience, their relationship with the police department. Does the mosque have a relationship with the police department? And this is because we know that mosques are under intense surveillance by the FBI, particularly since 9/11. And he says, I think the mosque has a pretty healthy relationship with the police department. Their training facility is actually right next to the mosque. So whenever we have Friday prayers or whenever we have Ramadan, the police are there directing traffic. Now, when it comes to actually patrolling the actual premises, usually that's done by private security within the mosque and not done by the officers. So what's happening here is that for South Asian and Arabs, a lot of mosques have been under attack, under threat of violence. This is nothing new. We see this with synagogues in the United States, across Europe, and also with mosques. We've seen it with Hindu temples as well. But that particularly since Trump's first term in 2016, because he was campaigning on such an anti-Muslim rhetoric, we saw a spike in anti-mosque activities. And so nationwide, this is the ACLU, has a map of where there has been anti-mosque incidents. So I'm from Texas. I grew up in Texas. And the mosque in my hometown of Fort Worth has been threatened with violence. There are mosques outside in Irving, Texas, which have been there have been armed men who have come to the mosque threatening the population. So the mosques have been working with the police to figure out how to sort of put into place some kind of security. This is different from what when I spoke to African American Muslims, specifically a Black urban mosque in Dallas, that they did have a relationship with the police, but the police had come in to talk to them more about community policing, something that we see happening in predominantly Black neighborhoods in the United States, versus the South Asian and Arab mosques. And there needs to be more research on this for sure, that were being threatened by Islamophobic groups that were increasing their attacks on mosques. So for example, outside in a rural town in Texas, a mosque was burned in the last 5 years. So here's where the survey data helps us understand this a little bit more. We asked, are there threats of violence at the place that you worship? And so for Protestants, for example, 31% said no, 7% said yes. For Muslims, 19% said yes, and 29% said no. A larger percentage said that they were not aware of any threats of violence. So they may not know. There might be threats, but they may not be aware of it. When we asked them about the relationship between your place of worship and local police, Protestants said 38% said very good and good, whereas Muslims, 25% said very good and 36% said good. So here's where, really understanding the racial and ethnic differences within these groups is important to note. When asked if you have private security, you can see that Muslims have a much a larger percentage, with 39% saying yes, versus Protestants 25% saying yes. And I just want to note, just anecdotally and from my own personal experience, this was something that I personally noticed when I was back home in Texas for Eid, and I was visiting my family, and I was at the mosque that I grew up going to, and they were giving out awards to security at the mosque, something I'd never seen before. Because and so when I asked, they said, well, we can't afford to hire the local police department, so they've created their own security team at the mosque, which are Muslims and congregants who go to the mosque. And that before Eid, there was an event at the mosque after prayers, and they were giving out awards to them. So this is a very new phenomenon that I think is happening as we see more and more white supremacist attacks on religious groups in the United States. So when I asked South Asian and Arab men and women, well, how do you feel about police? You know, do you trust them? And their response was very different from the African American Muslims that I interviewed. And they said, yeah, I do. I don't think the police are, at least in our area, we're very diverse. Dallas is a super diverse, so the police, I don't think they discriminate as much as in other places. So I feel comfortable calling them, and I feel safer if they're closer. In my country, if there is the presence of army or police, you wouldn't be able to sleep at night. But here it's the opposite, actually. So Salim, a Syrian man who was a college student in his 20s, was saying, you know, back in Syria, I did not feel safe with the police, but here in the United States, I do feel like they are here to protect me. And in fact, one other thing that I want to note is I was interviewing a South Asian young woman who said that, you know, she came home one night and she saw a car in her neighborhood in Dallas. She saw a car sitting outside of her house, and her parents weren't home. She lives with her parents, a college student. And she felt very, you know, she felt very unsafe with this car with somebody in it right outside of her house. So she called the police, and she said, I love the police. She was telling me, I love the police. They came, and, you know, the car left, and I felt so much safer with the police, this police officer coming. So a very different response between South Asian and Arab respondents compared to the African Americans. Muslims that I talked to. Now, I want to be clear that also a lot of the younger participants that I talked to were able to talk about Black Lives Matter, talked about when they were in college, had participated in protests, understood that there was you know, they understood police violence against African Americans and the history of that in the United States, yet still felt that they had a higher trust in police. So from our survey data, you can see here that for Protestants, they strongly agree, some would agree 39 and 32% that they trust police officers. For Muslims, you have strongly agree 28%, and some would agree 39%. But when you break it down by race, and this is just based on race, do you trust? You can see the difference in white, you know, going back to that Gallup poll, the 31 and 35% strongly agree, somewhat agree, and 18 and 26% of Black participants strongly agree or somewhat agree, a significant drop. But when you combine race and religion, you can see a much larger difference. So white, those who identify as white and Muslim, strongly agree and somewhat agree, 24 and 50% trust in police officers. So sort of supporting the qualitative interviews that we have versus the Black Muslims who 16% strongly agree and 25% somewhat agree. So, you know, just noting that, and it is a smaller percentage of the survey respondents, but that we do see a difference with African American and Muslims versus South Asian Arab. And to note that Arab Muslims are racially classified or have been racially classified in our census as white. So the other thing that I also want to add to this is that when I asked South Asian and Arab Muslims, have you been stopped by the police? And they've said only when I'm speeding. So their experiences are incredibly different, that they say, yeah, I was speeding, I got a ticket, and that was it. But I asked, have you been stopped when you're not speeding? And they were like, no, I've never been just stopped. So flying while Muslim. So we see there's a difference between African American and Black immigrant Muslims when it comes to being stopped by police. But what about when they're flying? And in that first book that I wrote, I have a whole chapter on the experiences of Muslims in airports. And this is the result of multiple laws and policies that were put into place after 9/11. So TSA, we didn't have the Transportation Security Administration prior to 9/11. That was created before the Department of Homeland Security was created. These are all post 9/11. And what TSA has are multiple different programs. So one is the no-fly list, which was on that slide in the beginning of the presentation. And if you were on the no-fly list, you cannot fly on a plane. We know that there's a cloud of secrecy over who's on the no-fly list. Different Muslim advocacy organizations in the United States have sued to try to find out who is on the no-fly list. We know that no-fly list and the security lists utilized in airports are coming from the terrorist databases that are the FBI oversees in the United States, and that because of the USA Patriot Act, the United States has increased the funding for these terrorist databases. We know that Dearborn, Michigan, that citizens who live in Dearborn, Michigan, the place in the United States that has the highest Muslim population per capita is overrepresented on the no-fly list. So we have a pretty good idea that it is Muslims who are Muslim names are populating the no-fly list. So Muslims, I asked them about multiple, are you allowed to fly? When you go to an airport, are you able to use your mobile boarding pass, to check in? And in the first book, what I found was that Muslim, South Asian, and Arab Muslim men, and this was prior to the mobile pass being more popular, would go to a self check-in kiosk and they would, put in their credit card and try to get their ticket. And the kiosk would give them a message saying that it couldn't give them their ticket, that they had to go speak to a TSA agent. And so they go and talk to a TSA agent, to a ticket agent, and they would be interrogated about where they were going, why they were going there. They would finally get a ticket, and that ticket had 4 S's on it, indicating that they were on the selectee list. And so if you're on the selectee list, it means that you're stopped and you can't get your ticket. You have to get it from a ticket agent where you're interrogated at the security line. You're pulled out of the line, you're interrogated, your body's checked, your bag is checked, and then you could be pulled up at the gate when you finally get to the gate, where you're interviewed and interrogated by the gate agent as well. So you undergo multiple forms of surveillance. So I found that Black Muslim women experienced some of the stops and searches in airports, because in the book, I also found that while Arab and South Asian Muslim women aren't on the selectee list, the one with the 4 S's, if they wear the hijab, when they go through security, they're always stopped and patted down, regardless if they made the metal detector go off or if they found anything on them in the body scanner. So for African American Muslim women who wear the hijab, they were having experiences when they went through the security line. And Hiba says, I just know that when I go to the airport, I'm always the one that's going to be searched. Always, always. It doesn't matter who I travel with. If I travel with my daughter, if I travel with my sister-in-law, my friend, my husband, I'm going to get the pat down. I've never not, since I've been Muslim, which was after I became Muslim after 9/11, I've never not had the pat down, wearing a scarf and all of that. So if you're African American, Black immigrant, and you wear the hijab, they were going to experience the same kinds of pat downs that South Asian and Arab and white Muslim white converts would experience if they wear the hijab when they're going through security. So their experiences are mimicking each other. But for African American men, they are not having the same experiences. And I attribute this to their names have not been changed. They have non-Muslim names. So Memphis, an African-American man from Texas, I've only got taken into a room to be physically searched. One time I was in New York coming back to Texas. I had both my hips replaced back in 2012. So automatically I go to additional screening because it's going to certainly set off the alarm. So he attributed being taken aside to his hip replacement surgery. I asked them, this does not mean that they're not surveilled. So anytime you increase surveillance in any space, racialized groups are going to experience more policing. So Simone Brown in her book Dark Matters actually has a chapter of Black women's experiences in airports. These are not Muslim women, but Black women who routinely have their hair checked in security lines. So anytime you increase the surveillance and policing, it's going to increase the policing of racialized groups. But the difference is when I asked African American Muslims, are you on a list? Were you told that you couldn't get your ticket? Have you been informed that you're on some kind of list? And they said no, that was not happening to them. So this is where their experiences diverge. And then lastly, the last point that I want to talk about from the qualitative interviews is being informants. So we know since 9/11 that there's been an increase in racialized groups being targeted to be informants. And so this is actually, if you go to Al Jazeera, there's a film that they have called Informants, which chronicles the experiences of Muslims being selected to either be the target of an FBI surveillance operation or are asked to become informants because they are vulnerable to the state due to perhaps a past criminal record. This is Corey Montiel. You should really check this one out because it almost seems like a Saturday Night Live skit where he was, he had issues with the law. The FBI approaches him, says, we want you to be an informant, go to this mosque in California, pretend you're a convert and try to find out if they're planning to commit any acts of terrorism. And so he does. He goes into this mosque in California. He says he wants to convert, that he has a history where his dad is Lebanese and his mom is white, and he's, wants to come back to the religion. And so they open their arms to him, and he comes in and he goes to the FBI and he says, I didn't find anything. They're not planning any terrorist attack. Well, they say, okay, go back and start to plan one and see what happens. So he goes back into the mosque and he starts to say, hey, let's commit I'm thinking about doing this. The Muslims in the mosque become suspicious of him and they actually call the FBI to say, hey, we're worried there's this guy who's coming into our mosque and saying he's going to commit an act of terror. So it turns out that the FBI is exposed through this for trying to, sort of bait Muslims into committing these acts. And actually, Corey and the Muslims from the mosque, the imam actually sued the FBI, and I believe they lost that case. We found that there were a few African American Muslims who were approached by the FBI to be informants. So Q, an African American man who was living in Dallas, and I think this case was when he was living in Georgia, said that, he was at his mom's old house and I used to live there. And it was one summer. And one of his neighbors said, are you interested in actually becoming an informant, to find terrorist cells and things like that within Muslim communities and whatnot? And we want to put you in places, and you can travel to different areas. But as soon as you become like compromised or things like that, you are no longer an asset, but a liability. And he was like, wherever you are, you will be left. So there were a few other participants who discussed being approached by the FBI to surveil immigrant Muslims in their community to find out if there were any terrorist activities going on. So this is something that we were looking at, like who is being asked to be an informant, and what are the, what are they looking for in terms of approaching Muslims? So I'm just going to sort of end the talk here, like, how are these two related? Well, one of the things is through fusion centers. So kind of going back to the driving while Muslim and this notion that African American Muslims are like this, nothing's changed. I still get stopped and searched when I'm driving. 9/11 didn't really change that. But indeed, we know that 9/11 has had an impact on this. So Rutgers came out with a report a few years ago that looked at what are called fusion centers. Fusion centers are these counterterrorism centers that popped up over across the country in the United States after 9/11. They were tasked with finding terrorist activities in those communities. So Boston has a fusion center, Austin has a fusion center, there are fusion centers in Maine, there are fusion centers in LA. All of these cities across the United States have fusion centers. When they have not, and they operate under different transparency rules than your local police departments, because when it comes to national security, the government will often say, we don't have to tell you what's happening because it will compromise our national security. So they're not accountable in the same kinds of ways. Well, when these fusion centers are not finding terrorist activities in their communities, what this report found was that then they were being used to do things like conduct broken windows policing in the Boston area and New Jersey and places like that. So it's mission creep, where you have a fusion center that its goal was to weed out terrorism being used to police Black and brown communities. So conducting broken windows searches, using, stopping and searching people when they're driving, looking for drugs, things like that. So we see that it has increased sort of the policing that we see that these participants were talking about experiencing. In the current moment, people have asked, post October 7th in the United States, we've seen a lot of concerns by the Muslim community, and people have asked, what's different? It feels a little bit like 9/11. There was a spike in anti-Muslim discrimination in the United States and also in Europe. And the response that I have given people as I've been giving talks across the country is that the difference between 9/11 and now is that we have these counterterrorism laws and policies in place that can now be used against other groups. So we know that the FBI, similar to COINTELPRO in the 70s, was misusing surveillance authorities to investigate Black Lives Matter protesters. So they were being surveilled by the FBI under foreign intelligence surveillance programs. More recently, Trump has ordered to push universities to monitor protesters on student visas. And he's doing this under this idea that if you were protesting and making the connection between protesters and terrorist groups abroad. So getting universities to sort of deport potentially students who are on student visas who participated in these protests under the, this sort of notion that they were being funded or that they were promoting terrorism, and that this is tied to global terrorists abroad. There's a bill that the House passed that would allow the Treasury Department to target nonprofits that it deemed providing material support to terrorism. So this bill passed the House. The Muslim community in the United States has been organizing around it. And what it would do is it would strip, any nonprofit of their tax-exempt status that was seen as providing any kind of material support for terrorism. So it could be an organism like USAID, for example. I think Elon Musk just tweeted this out today about USAID providing funding for organizations like Islamic Relief that provides provides donation and provides humanitarian aid globally. And if it's in Palestine or Gaza or any country that the United States has determined to be a potential terrorist threat, that they could be under threat of losing their tax exempt status, including Black Lives Matter, including all of these other groups. I also want to note that these laws and policies are much larger in scope than just Muslims, African American Muslims, or racialized groups. That, in fact, there is also a bill that's trying to get unruly passengers put on a no-fly list, because after COVID and COVID restrictions on airlines, there was a mask mandate for a while on airlines, and the Delta CEO said that if passengers would not abide by the mask mandate, that they should be put on the no-fly list because passengers were attacking flight attendants and whatnot. So Muslims have tried for a very long time in the United States to find out why they've been put on the no-fly list, with being met with the federal government saying that we cannot let you know because it would compromise national security. Whereas the Delta CEO said, let's put them on the no-fly list. When the mask mandate was removed, he said, let's pull them off the no-fly list, these unruly passengers. But there is a bill that was advocating to put unruly passengers. So this would be your drunk passengers, anyone who got in an argument could potentially be put on this no-fly list. And then lastly, and I'll end with this, we're seeing that this surveillance in Boston public schools, and this is something that we're seeing intensify right now in this moment, as this administration is really putting pressure on schools and universities to weed out anyone who's not documented in the United States. So over the past few years, we've seen an increase in state surveillance of schools in the Boston public schools where I live, and my daughter goes to a Boston public school. So are they identifying students that they view as potentially radicalized or a threat or whatnot? But we've seen that schools, that CVE grant that I talked about in the beginning, now those grants are going to schools, public schools, hospitals, police unions, and all kinds of other social workers. So getting more and more groups to participate in surveillance with the state. So the real takeaways are that in order to dismantle the war on drugs and the racialized policing that we've seen, we have to think about this in broader terms, that these are not separate wars, that the war on terror, the war on immigration, and the war on drugs are deeply connected to one another. And that hopefully, as I continue to publish more on the research, that we think through ways of coalition building around fighting against the abuses of civil rights abuses and humanitarian abuses that these wars have brought on.
Oh, thank you very much. I want to extend my thanks and thanks from the Identities team for the great talk, and thank you for everyone for their questions. And please do follow us on Blue Sky and LinkedIn and Saher's work and the Identities Journal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.